The military hearing room was packed with people in stiff uniforms and sharp suits. I sat at the front, my back straight and my heart hammering against my ribs. I am Captain Riley Morgan, and I have spent the last 10 years serving my country with everything I have. Today was supposed to be a day of celebration for my promotion to major, but instead, it felt like a trap. Suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the room swung open. My stepfather, Douglas Mercer, marched in like he was the one in command. He didn't look at me as he walked toward the front. He stood before the board and cleared his throat, his voice booming through the silent room. He loudly declared that my promotion was irregular, politically inflated, and not legitimately earned. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt the air leave my lungs as every eye in the room shifted toward me. My uniform, which I usually wore with such pride, suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Douglas demanded that the promotion board decision be reversed immediately. He claimed I had used influence instead of merit to get ahead. The room erupted into a wave of whispers that made my skin crawl. I looked at the officers sitting on the board, men and women I had respected for years, and saw the sudden doubt in their eyes. My attorney, Elena Price, rose sharply to object to this circus, but Douglas didn't back down. He leaned into the microphone, his face twisted in a smug grin. He was enjoying the chaos he had created. He started accusing me of cutting corners and using personal connections to bypass the hard work other officers had to do. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. I could feel my breath tightening as the weight of his lies began to settle over the room. Just as the noise reached a peak, the presiding officer slammed his gavel down. He announced a shocking escalation that made the entire room go dead silent. He stated that because of these serious allegations, the Inspector General's office had been notified and would perform a full review of the case. My heart stopped. The hearing was suspended until the IG testimony could be scheduled. Douglas looked at me and winked, knowing he had just derailed my entire life. Being escorted out of that room was one of the most humiliating moments of my career. I walked down the long hallway, and I could feel my colleagues avoiding eye contact. People I had served with in the field suddenly found the floor very interesting as I passed by. I saw Douglas standing by the water fountain, smirking at me like he had already won. He looked satisfied that he had planted a seed of doubt that might never go away. Elena grabbed my arm and pulled me into a side room, her face very serious. She warned me that this was no longer an informal family dispute. Because the IG was involved, this had become a massive institutional problem. One wrong move now could end my career forever. Later that afternoon, the official notice arrived in my email. My promotion was officially under an integrity review. It felt like years of late nights, dangerous deployments, and personal sacrifices were collapsing into a pile of suspicion. I sat in my dark office, staring at the screen, as the IG office confirmed they were opening a preliminary inquiry. They were pulling my full service record for a complete audit. The following week felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Douglas wasn't finished with his attack, he was just getting started. He submitted a long list of written objections to the board, claiming that I had skipped evaluation steps throughout my career. As I read through his complaints, a cold chill ran down my spine. He had dates, names of units, and specific project details that only someone who had been watching me very closely would know. I realized with a jolt of horror that he had been tracking my career for years, waiting for the exact moment when I had the most to lose. He had been a predator in my own home, gathering ammunition while I thought he was just being a supportive parent. Elena spent hours going through his statements, her eyes narrowed as she compared them to my actual records. She eventually looked up from a stack of papers and told me she had found something interesting. There were tiny inconsistencies in his stories, dates that didn't quite match and events that sounded slightly exaggerated. She sensed that he was trying too hard to make me look bad, and that was our first real lead. I tried to reach out to my mother, Karen Morgan, but the phone calls were shorter and colder every time. I finally cornered her in the kitchen of our family home, asking her what Douglas had told her about my promotion. She looked away, her hands shaking as she held a coffee mug. She refused to speak, her silence speaking louder than any words could. I could feel a deep emotional betrayal forming in my chest. She was my mother, yet she was letting this man destroy her own daughter's reputation. She looked like she was caught between two fires, and she wasn't choosing me. Elena didn't let the silence stop her. She filed a series of subpoenas for bank and personnel records, determined to find out how Douglas knew so much about my private military files. We needed to know if someone on the inside was helping him or if he had found another way to break into the system. As the legal wheels started turning, the tension in our family reached a breaking point. Douglas walked into the room and told me I should just resign now to save everyone the embarrassment. I told him I would see him in court. A few days later, a new wave of panic hit me. Elena called with news that made my stomach turn. Parts of my early evaluation reports from years ago appeared to be incomplete or missing in the official digital archive. I knew I had completed those evaluations, but the system showed gaps that looked very suspicious. Suspicion started to spread quietly among the board officials who were overseeing my case. They were starting to wonder if Douglas was right, if I had actually skipped steps and someone had covered for me. It was the perfect trap. Without those files, I couldn't prove I had earned my way up. I felt like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. Just when things looked their worst, we got word that a formal IG investigator had been assigned to the case. This meant a neutral party would finally be looking at the facts, but it also meant that every single mistake I had ever made would be put under a microscope. I had to trust that the truth was enough, even if the records were failing me. I spent the night looking through my own old boxes of paperwork, praying I had kept copies. The call I had been dreading finally came. Major General Adrian Cole's office, the head of the Inspector General's division, requested my presence for formal questioning. This wasn't a friendly chat, it was a high-stakes interview that would be recorded and used in the final report. As I walked toward the building, I saw Douglas standing near the entrance. He looked more confident than ever, probably thinking I would finally collapse under the intense pressure of a general's questioning. He gave me a little mock salute that made my blood boil. I ignored him and walked inside, keeping my chin up and my eyes forward. I entered the room and saw Major General Cole sitting behind a heavy wooden desk. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. He didn't smile, but he didn't look angry either. He just looked like he wanted the truth. Elena sat beside me as the recorder was turned on. The general started asking about my early assignments and how I had handled specific leadership challenges. I didn't hold anything back. I agreed to full cooperation, offering him access to every email and personal log I had from my time in the service. While the investigation was happening behind closed doors, a narrative war began to explode in the hallways of the base. Media outlets that follow military news started circulating whispers about a promotion controversy involving a high-ranking captain. I could feel my reputation slipping through my fingers like sand. People I didn't even know were talking about my career as if it were a scandal. Every time I walked into the mess hall, the room would go quiet for a second before the whispering started again. It was a slow, painful kind of torture. Then, the ultimate blow landed. An anonymous leak appeared online, detailing some of the missing evaluation files Douglas had mentioned. It was a calculated move to turn public opinion against me before the IG could even finish the review. The leak made it look like I was being protected by a good old boys network, which was ironic since Douglas was the one trying to use his influence to crush me. I felt like I was fighting a ghost, someone who was attacking me from the shadows while I had to follow all the rules. I was losing the battle for my own name. The day the inquiry officially reopened, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Major General Cole entered the room with a calm authority that seemed to quiet the entire building. He didn't look at the gallery, he just focused on the files in front of him. Douglas was there, of course, sitting in the front row and trying his best to look like an important witness. He kept trying to catch the general's eye, leaning forward as if he wanted to offer more helpful information. He was clearly trying to impress the IG and show that he was a concerned citizen just looking out for the integrity of the army. The general didn't even acknowledge his presence. He sat down and adjusted his glasses, his face completely unreadable. Then, he made a formal announcement that changed the entire direction of the hearing. He stated that a classified review had been initiated to look into the specifics of my service that weren't available in the public record. This was a double-edged sword. It meant the truth might be hidden, but it also meant Douglas couldn't use his public lies to twist the facts anymore. The room went still as the first witness was called. The first person to take the stand was a senior officer I had served under during a very difficult deployment. He didn't look at Douglas, he looked straight at the board. He testified with incredible detail about how I had led critical operations under extreme conditions. He spoke about a night in a combat zone where my quick thinking had saved an entire platoon from an ambush. He described my leadership as exemplary and fearless. As he spoke, I saw Douglas's confident expression begin to crack for the first time. He started shifting in his seat, his face turning a dull shade of red. He hadn't expected someone to come forward with such powerful, first-hand evidence of my merit. The weight of the colonel's words seemed to push back against the cloud of doubt Douglas had created. Then, Major General Cole leaned forward and made a request that sent a shockwave through the room. He requested that the sealed operational files from that deployment be brought into the inquiry. These were the files that would show exactly why I had been fast-tracked for promotion. Douglas looked like he had just realized he was in a fight he couldn't win with just words. As the hearing continued, the evidence started to turn against Douglas in a big way. Elena produced a set of old commendation acknowledgments that Douglas had signed himself years ago. In these documents, he had officially supported my performance and praised my dedication to the service. He had even written a letter to my commanding officer at the time, saying how proud he was of my achievements. When Elena showed these to the board, the room gasped. Douglas turned white and then immediately denied they were real. He claimed he had never seen them and that his signature must have been forged. He was backed into a corner, and his only move was to lie even louder. Major General Cole didn't look impressed by the outburst. He calmly ordered an immediate signature verification to be performed by a forensic expert. He wanted to know if Douglas was telling the truth or if he was lying under oath. The tension was so thick it felt like it would snap. I looked at Douglas and realized he was desperate. He was willing to burn everything down just to avoid being proven wrong. The most painful part of the day came when my mother, Karen, was called to testify. She walked to the stand with her head down, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. When she finally started speaking, her voice was barely a whisper. She admitted that Douglas had become obsessed with controlling Riley's career decisions. She described how he would spend hours on the computer, looking up military regulations and trying to find ways to influence my assignments. She said he felt like I owed him for the way he had raised me and that he wanted to be the one to decide how high I climbed. An emotional shock spread through the courtroom as people realized the level of obsession he had developed. I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. My home had been a surveillance zone for years, and I had never even known it. Elena requested an emergency recess because my mother was clearly too upset to continue. The general granted it, and I sat in my chair, feeling completely numb. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie, and the whole world was watching it fall apart. When we returned from the break, Douglas tried to shift his tactics. He realized his merit argument was failing, so he tried to attack my character instead. He stood up and claimed that I had manipulated command relationships to get my promotion. He suggested that I had used my personal charm or inappropriate influence to get senior officers to favor me. It was a disgusting, sexist attack meant to shame me in front of my peers. I felt my face flush with anger, but I didn't say a word. I knew that reacting would only give him what he wanted. He was reshaping reality in real time, trying to find any mud that would stick. Major General Cole had seen enough. He interrupted Douglas with a voice like a whip, warning him against giving false testimony or making baseless accusations in a military inquiry. He told Douglas that this was his final warning. The room was deathly quiet as Douglas sat down, fuming. I realized then that the general wasn't just a judge, he was a protector of the institution's integrity. He wasn't going to let Douglas turn this into a gutter fight. The moment we had all been waiting for finally arrived. The doors to the room were locked, and a guard was placed outside. Major General Cole announced that he had received the classified promotion board documentation. These were the internal records of the officers who had actually voted on my promotion. The air in the room became instantly tense. This was the ultimate proof of whether I had earned my rank or if there had been some kind of irregularity, like Douglas claimed. I held my breath as the general began to read through the files. He spent a long time looking at the signatures and the comments left by the board members. Douglas was staring at the general, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and anticipation. He still hoped that there was some tiny error he could exploit. After what felt like an eternity, the general looked up and announced that a partial disclosure had been approved for the inquiry. He was going to share the findings with the room. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if I would fly or fall. The truth finally emerged with the force of a tidal wave. Major General Cole looked directly at the board and then at the gallery. He stated that the documents confirmed my promotion was unanimous. Every single member of the promotion board had voted for me based on my record of operational merit authority. They hadn't just given me the rank, they had practically demanded it because of my performance in the field. There was no politics, no influence, and no irregularity whatsoever. As the words filled the room, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I could finally breathe again. Douglas, on the other hand, completely lost his composure. He started shouting that the records were fake and that the military was just protecting its own. He looked unhinged, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He had built his entire case on the idea that I was a fraud, and now the highest authority in the room was calling him a liar. The IG began preparing a formal testimony statement that would put an end to the debate once and for all. Douglas was finished, and everyone in the room knew it. The official IG testimony began the next morning. Major General Cole took the stand, not as a judge this time, but as a witness for the truth. He formally testified that my career progression was fully legitimate, verified, and consistent with the highest standards of the United States Army. His voice was steady and authoritative, leaving no room for any more questions. The room went silent as the weight of his words settled over everyone. It was the ultimate vindication. I looked over at Douglas and saw him try to stand up and interrupt. He started to say something about hidden secrets, but the general shut him down with a single look. A guard moved toward Douglas, signaling that his time for talking was over. The narrative that had been built against me for weeks was being dismantled in minutes. I felt a surge of pride in my service and the system that had finally come through for me. The truth wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon, and the general was using it to clear my name. The whispers in the hallway would finally stop, replaced by the facts of my hard work. But the investigation didn't stop with my promotion. The IG had found something even more disturbing during the audit. Evidence was presented that showed Douglas had repeatedly contacted military administrative offices over the last 3 years. He had been posing as a concerned relative, attempting to question my evaluations and find ways to lower my scores. He had even sent anonymous emails to my commanders, trying to plant seeds of doubt about my leadership abilities. A wave of shock spread through the room as the depth of his interference was revealed. He hadn't just attacked me at the hearing, he had been trying to sabotage my career from the inside for years. It was a level of betrayal I could barely wrap my mind around. The general announced that the investigation was now expanding to look into how Douglas had gained access to these private administrative channels. He had crossed a line that involved federal records and military security. What started as a promotion challenge was turning into a criminal investigation into Douglas's own actions. He had tried to put me in a cage, but he was the one who was finally being trapped. As the audit went deeper, the real motive for Douglas's actions finally came to light. Elena presented financial records that suggested Douglas had a very personal reason for wanting to control my rank. He was facing massive personal debts, and he had been looking into dependency benefits that were tied to my military status and rank. He realized that if I reached a certain level, he could claim a larger portion of support or use my status to secure loans he couldn't get on his own. The emotional betrayal deepened as I realized he didn't even hate me, he just saw me as a financial asset he wanted to manage. He was willing to destroy my reputation and my career just to pay off his own bad choices. A formal legal review was triggered to see if his actions constituted a form of financial fraud or coercion. I looked at my mother, who was sitting in the back, her face buried in her hands. She had been his partner in this house, yet she had never seen the monster living right next to her. The man who claimed to have raised me had actually been plotting to sell my future for his own gain. The investigation turned back to my mother's role in the whole mess. Under questioning from the IG, Karen admitted that she had signed several documents Douglas had brought home without fully understanding their military impact. He had told her they were just standard family updates or paperwork for the housing office. She had trusted him, and he had used that trust to gain a foothold in my personnel files. I felt a painful mix of anger and sadness as I watched her struggle to explain herself. She wasn't a mastermind, she was a victim of his manipulation, but her lack of curiosity had almost cost me everything. The IG began asking sharp questions about possible coercion, whether Douglas had pressured or threatened her into signing those forms. It was clear that the family Douglas had built was held together by lies and control. Riley, sat there watching my family history being rewritten as a series of tactical moves by a man who only cared about himself. The general looked at my mother with a pitying expression, but he didn't stop the questioning. The truth had to be fully exposed, no matter how much it hurt. Douglas was finally called back to the stand to answer for the evidence against him. He didn't have any legal arguments left, so he became defensive and highly emotional. He started shouting about how he had raised me like his own command structure, and that I wouldn't be anything without his guidance. He claimed he had a right to oversee my career because of all the years he had spent as my stepfather. It was a desperate, pathetic argument that held no weight in a military hearing. He tried to play the role of the hurt parent, but the room saw right through it. The IG general watched him with a look of pure clinical interest, like he was studying a failing piece of equipment. He pointed out that raising someone doesn't give you the right to commit fraud or interfere with federal promotion boards. The argument completely collapsed under the general's scrutiny. Douglas's credibility was officially called into question, and his standing as a witness was revoked. He was no longer the accuser, he was just a man caught in a web of his own making. The end was finally in sight. The consequences for Douglas started to pile up quickly. Because he had tampered with personnel systems and tried to influence a federal board, the Military Oversight Division expanded the investigation into his entire history with government systems. They wanted to know if he had done this to anyone else or if he had committed other crimes using his family connections. Douglas finally realized that he was no longer in control of the situation. The smug grin was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic as he realized he could be facing real disciplinary referrals and even criminal charges. He had tried to use the military system to crush me, but the system had turned around and was now crushing him. He sat at his table, shaking, as the general read out the list of potential violations. It was a total reversal of power. He had come into the hearing to take my rank, but he was going to leave with nothing but a mountain of legal trouble. I felt a strange sense of peace as I watched him. The man who had been the shadow over my life was finally being brought into the light. A few days later, the final report from the Inspector General was released. It was a massive document, but the conclusion was clear. The IG confirmed that my entire career progression was clean, consistent, and exemplary. There wasn't a single mark against my integrity. Every promotion, every award, and every evaluation had been earned through hard work and sacrifice. The missing files were found in an old backup system, proving that they had been completed on time and with high marks. A massive wave of relief finally replaced the tension that had been living in my chest for weeks. I could walk through the base now with my head held high, knowing that the highest authority in the army had backed me up. The final hearing was scheduled just to deliver the formal ruling and close the case forever. I spent the afternoon at the gym, pushing myself until my muscles burned, feeling stronger than I had in years. I wasn't just a captain anymore, I was a soldier who had survived a different kind of war, and I had won. On the morning of the final ruling, Douglas made one last, desperate move. He tried to speak before the board, claiming emotional authority over my upbringing to justify his original challenge. He tried to tell a story about how he had taught me leadership and that he was just trying to hold me to the high standard he set. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. The board members didn't even look at him. They had seen the bank records, the forged signatures, and the logs of his unauthorized calls. His words were just noise in a room that was now dedicated to the facts. The board formally rejected his statement and ordered him to be silent. The room felt cold and professional, a place where lies were no longer welcome. My attorney, Elena, stood up for the closing arguments, but she didn't need to say much. The IG's report had done all the work for us. The case was closed, and all that was left was the final determination. I looked at the flag behind the general's desk and felt a deep sense of pride. I had protected my honor, and the system had protected me. The final determination was read aloud in a voice that echoed through the hall. The IG report formally cleared me of all allegations and condemned the improper and malicious interference in my promotion review. The board officially reinstated my promotion to major, effective immediately. Then, the hammer fell on Douglas. He was formally reprimanded and barred from any further contact with military administrative offices. The general also announced that the evidence of his fraud was being turned over to civil authorities for potential prosecution. Douglas was escorted out of the room by military police, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't look at me as he was led away. The final ruling was delivered with a sharp crack of the gavel, ending the nightmare once and for all. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence fill the room. The fight was over. I had my rank, I had my reputation, and most importantly, I had the truth. I looked at my mother, who was sitting alone in the gallery, and felt a pang of sadness for the family we used to be. I left the building alone, the afternoon sun feeling warm on my face. My promotion was officially intact, and my reputation had been restored across the entire base. As I walked to my car, I saw my mother watching me from a distance. She looked broken by the consequences of her silence, but I didn't have anything left to say to her. Douglas was gone, escorted out under administrative sanctions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I realized as I drove away that the fight was never really about the rank of major. It was about ownership of my own identity and my own story. Douglas had tried to rewrite my life to fit his greed, but he had failed. I felt a profound sense of freedom that I hadn't known was missing. I wasn't just moving forward in my career, I was moving forward in my life, finally free from the man who had tried to control my path. I didn't feel like I had won a victory, I felt like I had reclaimed my soul. I turned onto the main road, ready to start my new command, leaving the shadows of the past behind me for good.